How you doing? It's Decayed Teeth. I'm a registered nurse. I've been working in the emergency department since August 2022. I've worked at level 1 facilities, level 2 facilities. I've got basic life support, advanced life support, pediatric life support. I'm now a travel nurse, have been since December 2024. Prior to that, I was a staff nurse for around 2 years working at a level 2 facility. I've worked at level 1 facilities, level 2 facilities. I've seen all types of stuff, been through all types of stuff. I've seen stabbings, I've seen shootings. I've seen people get skull fractures because of a bottle being smashed into their head. I've seen, tragic accidents where people have fallen. I've dealt with a lot of codes where people were needed to be resuscitated. I've dealt with all types of drips, cardizem drips, insulin drips, etc. So I feel as though this is a scenario that I would be highly qualified to talk about. So for those who don't know the situation, there's this guy. His name is Ben 10. That's his street name, I guess. He's close to NBA Youngboy. If you don't know who that is, he's a very famous rapper. And NBA Ben 10, he was in a situation where there was something like he was trying to rob somebody or something along those lines. Long story short, he was shot. He was stood over. In other words, the person who was the assailant was in front of him, aimed a gun at him, and started squeezing the trigger until there was no more bullets left inside of the chamber, in the magazine. And he went to the hospital. Ben 10 went to the hospital, and the issue is that Ben 10 has not been photographed or videoed standing up at all. All of the pictures or videos of him, videos of himself have been in the hospital bed. This right here is especially important because Ben 10, initially he was believed to have been dead. There was someone, I believe his name was Seti Nash. He said that Ben 10 died a few times, and he was brought back to life a few times, and there was some statements that he was on life support, and then there was some reports that he was going to be taken off of life support, and the NBA Youngboy, who's a very famous artist, was apparently came over to the hospital to visit him or something along those lines, and so that they could say their last goodbyes. And long story short, this is a very serious situation, and he was photographed in a cervical collar. One of the main reasons why I'm speaking about this is because it's pretty big news, especially considering the person who was reported to have shot him went on this huge PR run where he was making music about shooting him. He was making jokes like a Ben 10 dance where he essentially showed how Ben 10 was responding when he was being shot. And now he's in jail in the feds for the same shooting. So I feel as though this story is evolving. So I feel as though this is a situation where maybe I can put in some very qualified input. There was also some very interesting information that the FBI put out, apparently saying that there were 2 people who were shot, and there was one person who had their finger blown off, and then the other person said that they had no sensation in their lower half. The person believed to have no sensation in their lower half, that's believed to be Ben 10. This story had continued to evolve to show that Ben 10 most recently photographed himself in a wheelchair. So the easiest and most efficient way I would think to do this would be to go through the protocol, the standard protocol for traumas, especially traumas this significant. So usually there would be like a call, and EMS would notify the facility that they got a trauma. They would say gunshot wounds, GSW. Then they would bring in the patient, and then the person's clothes would be cut off. In some scenarios, depending on the belief of the severity of the injury, they would do something called a something called a FAST, which stands for a focused assessment with sonography for trauma. The main purpose of that is to see whether or not there was anything significant that was punctured or any sort of internal bleeding that could be immediately identified. Afterwards, once the patient is believed to be stabilized, in this situation, they might have intubated him. They would likely put some pads on him, defibrillation pads, considering the extent of the trauma. One of the main reasons why he would likely have been intubated at this point is just to protect the airway, especially considering it's not known where the injuries are or how significant the injuries are, and it would likely an X-ray would also be had to determine whether or not there was any internal bleeding, especially from any gunshot wounds. With an X-ray, it would be able to be determined whether there would be internal bleeding through any white opaque areas. Those are referred to as consolidations. If there's a lot of white in the area, that would mean that there's not a lot of oxygen in the area. Oxygen in the area would be seen as dark spots. Well, it would be dark. This is obviously important because it would require for there to be a chest tube. We did not see a chest tube with Ben 10. Afterwards, it would be likely that an immediate CAT scan would be had, this person having priority for a CAT scan. A CAT scan is something that would show whether or not there were any issues with the organs, any sort of organ punctures, etc. The other significant purpose of the CAT scan is the CAT scan can also miss some things that the X-ray may not have found. The X-ray is significant, particularly for bones, whereas the CAT scan is for organs. It would also be expected, especially considering this is a trauma, for a cervical collar to have been placed on the patient. So the purpose of a cervical collar is to stabilize the cervical spine. There are three parts of the spine. There's the cervical, thoracic, and the lumbar section. However, if you see someone with a cervical collar, that is specifically to stabilize the cervical spine. The reason why a cervical collar is placed, especially for traumas, is if there is any sort of trauma related to the cervical spine and the cervical spine is not stabilized, then that could lead to a complete disconnection of the cervical spine. The cervical collar is typically placed by EMS prior to the patient being picked up, or as soon as a cervical collar can be placed, because the longer the cervical spine is not stabilized, the more likely it is that if there is a significant trauma that the cervical spine could be disconnected, which would result in permanent injury. Typically, we would receive the patient. The patient would go to the CAT scan, then they would return to the emergency department, and then because of this scenario, Ben 10 would have priority for an ICU bed. He would surely be going to the ICU. He would either go to the ICU, med-surg, which is just general admission, like if you have like a cold or something, or you have a fever, or if you have an infection or a diabetic episode. Or then there's telemetry. Telemetry is specifically for those who need their heart monitored. Then there's PCU, which is step down, which is a level below ICU, but it's still a relatively high acuity. And then there would be ICU. The Ben 10 would surely be going over to ICU. Then he would go over to ICU, and then they would determine whether, due to the results of the CAT scan, whether they would discontinue his cervical collar. You can also see that he still has the pads on, the defibrillation pads from the emergency department. So that shows that he is in a relatively unstable condition, and there is a chance that he could have he might have needed to be defibrillated, like what Seti Nash said, but that cannot be confirmed. It could be the case that he was deemed to be unstable enough that they would prefer to maintain the defibrillation pads on him. Typically, the cervical collar would be discontinued within maybe an hour to maybe maximum 2 hours. That's like worst case scenario, usually 2 hours, especially considering the significance of this situation. And then it would be discontinued. However, his cervical collar was not discontinued for a total of around it was a few weeks that his cervical collar was not discontinued, showing that he almost certainly had and has a cervical fracture, which explains why there was a or is a lack of sensation in his lower extremities. Typically, how it goes is a cervical collar is placed until a CT scan is done, and then once a CT scan is completed, it will be confirmed or denied as to whether there is a cervical fracture. If there is a cervical fracture, then the cervical collar will remain in place until a second CT scan is done, and the second CT scan will show that the cervical fracture is stable enough that the cervical collar can come off. However, if there is a complete cervical disconnection, then that would result in complete paralysis. If it is a lumbar or a thoracic fracture, then the person would be wearing a back brace. The person would be fitted for the back brace, and then they would wear a back brace, and the same protocol would be had where they would return for a repeat CAT scan, and then the back brace would be removed once it shows that the fracture has resolved. In this particular case, we can see, because of the presence of the cervical collar that and the lack of a back brace being present, that the primary focus here would be the cervical region. This is significant, especially because when it comes to cervical fractures, the patient may, well, in my personal life, there was a patient who had a cervical fracture. This is when I was a CNA. They had a cervical fracture because they were in a car crash, and there was a complete disconnection of their cervical spine. So they completely lost sensation from the middle of their arm down to their toes. So they could not, they did not have any sensation from any of those areas. So part of their lungs were also paralyzed, which affected their ability to speak. And they could move their shoulders, and they could move part of their elbow, but they could not move any from below the location of the cervical disconnection. So because of that, it seems as though Ben 10 did not suffer a complete disconnection of his cervical spine, which means that there is a chance for his recovery. He would just need to go to therapy and continue. Well, it seems as though the cervical collar has been discontinued, so he would just need to have physical therapy, and then they would see in the coming months whether any sort of sensation would return to his feet or to his lower body. If there was a complete separation of his cervical spine, then it would likely be that he would suffer the same fate as the person who I had mentioned previously, who had no sensation from the area of the cervical disconnection down. So this right here would be an incomplete fracture. In other words, there's still hope for him, but it's not 100%. There could be the case that he will forever suffer because of the cervical fracture. He will forever suffer from some form of neurological defects. Maybe he will forever have trouble walking, or maybe there will be some sense of sensation that will never return, or he could never walk again. This could also be the case, but because of the information that's present, it seems as though it could be that he could be walking again, but as of right now, he would need to go to physical therapy for the hope that he will walk again in the coming months. You know, we would have to wait maybe 6 months to determine whether he would or would not return to the way that he was previously, but it's best to hope in these situations. So that's it. Make sure that you like and subscribe. Let me know if you want to see any other videos, and that's it. Give me some ideas of something that you want to see, or something where you would want to have some sort of someone's input who is qualified, a medical professional like myself.